So this is just a little note about tapping practices to optimize yields over the long term, specifically when we're talking about red maples. So whether we're talking about red maples or sugar maples or birch or black walnut, the fundamental guiding principles for selecting tapping practices that are going to optimize yields over the long term are the same. And that is that the tapping practices that we choose for this season are going to impact the yields not only that we obtain from trees this season, but also the yields of future seasons. And so we know that the tapping practices of the current year impact yields, or they should impact yields. So deeper tap holes, larger diameter tap holes, more taps per tree are generally going to result in more sap. But those same things are also generally going to result in more non-conductive wood being developed by the tree. Generally speaking, the size of the amount of non-conductive wood that is generated by the tree in response to the tap hole wound is proportional to the size of the wound. So all of these things are going to give us more sap, but also more non-conductive wood. And as the quantity of non-conductive wood increases in the tapping zone of the tree, it's also going to increase the risk of tapping into non-conductive wood in the future. And that increases the risk of future reduced yields because we know that when we drill a tap hole into non-conductive wood, we're going to have very reduced yields. And in fact, a study done by my colleague Mark Islehart, where he intentionally drilled tap holes into non-conductive wood, showed that on average, the reduction was 75%. So that's not a small number. And in his study, he also showed that the reduction was proportional to the amount of non-conductive wood hit. So the more non-conductive wood you hit, the bigger the reduction is going to be. So with taking those two things together, the tapping practices that we choose in the current season need to be a balance of the yields that we really want for the current yield, so the best yields that we can possibly have, while balancing the accumulation of non-conductive wood to ensure that the quantity of conductive wood remains high over time, and thus the chances of hitting non-conductive wood and getting reduced yields remain negligible. And this all has to be done while integrating especially the tree's growth rate, but also its size and how much non-conductive wood is already present. And if you want to hear more about how all of those factors interrelate with one another, you can check out this presentation that I have listed here below. But for the moment, what's important to remember is that it is the tree's radial growth rate that's really the key here, because that determines how much new conductive wood is added to the tapping zone each year, added to the tree each year. And so that determines how much new non-conductive wood that tree can support while also maintaining that level of non-conductive wood at really minimal levels and a risk of reduced yields at really minimal levels. So when it comes to red maple, the parts of this equation, or the part of this equation that is really important to focus in on, is the quantity of non-conductive wood. So first of all, there's a myth that red maples are less capable of compartmentalizing wounds than sugar maples, and that's actually not true. So when we drill a tap hole into healthy sapwood, so clear sapwood like this, in a red maple, the quantity of non-conductive wood that the tree develops in response to that wound is the same as it would be in a sugar maple. And this was demonstrated by my colleague Tim Wilmot with one of his studies, and it's also been demonstrated microscopically in previous studies too. So the two species are equally capable of compartmentalizing wounds. So the myth that red maples are not as good at it is just that, it's a myth. However, even with that, it's still typical that red maples can have a tendency to have more non-conductive wood inside, even though they're just as good at compartmentalizing wounds. And this is because, of course, the wood is softer, their branches break more frequently, more easily. And each time that happens, that's a wound, and the tree is going to generate non-conductive wood as it tries to compartmentalize that wound. So in general, red maples can have a tendency to just have more non-conductive wood inside. And in addition to that, some red maples, not all of them, but some can also have this large column, central column of non-conductive wood. And this happens based as a result of wounds that happen early in the life of the tree. So a stump sprout that dies if it's a multi-stem tree or a stem that dies if it's a multi-stem tree that begins life as a stump sprout, a low branch that dies, etc. And that persists over time. And so, one thing that is of note here is that when this trait is present, it could affect the overall yields that are possible from that tree. So, we've seen before, we've shown in our studies that the fundamental yields from red maples are the same as sugar maples when all things are equal. But it's possible that when this trait is present, that those trees may have lower overall yields because, as you can see, there's not a lot of clear conductive sapwood here to either collect sap from or for the tree to store sugar in even. So unfortunately, we don't have any data. We don't have a specific study that has data on the impact of this trait on yield. I would love to do that. It's a little bit challenging to set that up, but anyway, maybe in the future. But for now, for this discussion, what's important to focus in on is that that's a pretty big quantity of non-conductive wood, and it can be very close to the surface, close to and within the tapping zone where you're going to drill. So taking all of that together, when it comes to red maples, it is generally probably prudent to consider the risk of tapping into non-conductive wood higher than it is in sugar maple, just fundamentally. And with that, it's thus probably generally a good idea, prudent, to use slightly less intense tapping practices with red maple to ensure that those yields remain as high as possible over time and that non-conductive wood doesn't overdevelop to levels that really affect yields over time. This is particularly true with tapping depth, especially when that trait of the central column of discolored wood is present. So, and just one little additional note, and that is that although we tend to talk about the risk from tapping into non-conductive wood as being that of future reduced yields, it's also important that another consequence of this is that when we tap into non-conductive wood, it also results in a much greater quantity of non-conductive wood that the tree develops in response to that. So you can see here in this picture that this tap hole was drilled into an old branch scar. And so this shows that when that happens, when a new wound encounters already compartmentalized wood, the amount of non-conductive wood is much greater than we would see or than would result from an individual wound into clear conductive sapwood. So because really when that compartmentalized wood, that new wound is encountered, it's non-conductive. It does not contain the same defenses that conductive sapwood has. It's basically like tapping into a defenseless area of the tree. And so as a result, a lot of non-conductive wood can develop. And that's not good for the tree. And also it does continue to add to the amount of non-conductive wood that's present in the tree. And that is going to potentially impact yields over time. And that is true for red maples. It's true for sugar maples. When we tap into pre-existing wounds, there is a much larger amount of non-conductive wood that develops. So it's just another thing to think about.